Hi folks, I'm talking to YouTuber and Sky News Australia contributor Daisy Cousens, who put out a very interesting video recently about the darkest timeline of politics in the English-speaking world. I found it very interesting, so I thought I'd get her on to have a chat. Daisy, how are you doing?
I am very well, thank you, Carl. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good, really good. So, what was the inspiration for your darkest timeline video? What made you sort of go down that line of thought?
Well, I was just feeling sort of terrible and devastated and despairing after what happened on January 6th, because the sheer magnitude of lies that were flying around about Trump apparently inciting violence when he specifically said march patriotically and peacefully. He then called out the violence in the middle of it and told everyone to be peaceful and go home. And I was just seeing the media totally misreport and the Democrats capitalize on it. And I thought, oh my God, the world is going to hell. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. And on top of that, I couldn't really talk about it on YouTube because they were canning accounts left, right, and center. So no one really knew what to talk about. So I literally ducked for cover for like 10 days. I didn't post a video, and usually I post like twice a week. And in that time, I was thinking, what the hell am I going to make content about? Like, what on earth am I going to do here? The world has totally changed. I don't feel like I can cut through. So I thought, hey, I'm feeling really pessimistic. How about I just write that pessimism, in a kind of creative way? I always try to experiment with new types of content at the beginning of each year, and it was January, felt like a good time. So I thought, I'm going to write the worst, most drastic, most awful kind of worst case scenario I can possibly think of, and I'm going to turn it into a YouTube video somehow, and I'm going to see what people think. And so once I started writing, I could not stop writing. It was the most bizarre thing, and I got to 4,000 words, and I thought, this is two videos worth. I'm going to have to turn this into Act 1 and Act 2. Like it was so much fun. So yeah, I had part 1, and then I had the sequel, which was part 2, and I thought, I don't know what the hell people are going to think.
Excuse me, sorry.
But it turned out really well, and I talked about secession,
Mm.
cannibal tribes at one point. But yeah, it was good fun. It was
Yeah.
great fun.
So, how do you feel about the way that Trump's impeachment went?
Look, I mean, we always knew he was going to get acquitted, and we always knew roughly which, red half of the Party members, the rhinos, were going to vote against him. I mean, I was so sort of appalled about the whole thing that I tuned a lot of it out during the week because it was just so nonsensical. And the Democrats were just going to fabricate everything, which they did because they had nothing to go on. I mean, we know for a fact Trump did not incite that violence. In fact, he spoke against it. So I knew the whole thing was going to be this dreadful show trial. And it shows how little they had to go on, that they actually did have to invent things in order to have any kind of argument. And of course, the Trump lawyers came in and just blasted them, which was absolutely glorious. So he's added kind of another feather to his cap, Trump, hasn't he? People are saying he's the most acquitted president in history, which I think is a nice kind of turn on the Democrats yelling that he's the most impeached president in history. Well, yeah, but guess what? He's also the most acquitted, which says an awful lot about the Democrats, I think. So I'm pleased with how it went. I love the fact that Josh Hawley was up in the gallery with his feet up on the seat at one point, looking through a manila folder. I thought, oh
I
my
didn't even
God.
notice that. That's fantastic.
Oh, it was so good. I reckon he's eyeing a run in 2024.
Mm.
So he's kind of building up his personality now. But yeah, look, it had the outcome we knew it would have. And it just exposed the Democrats again for being terrible megalomaniacs.
Well, okay, that's a really great way to lead into what I wanted to talk about. And it is, I guess, what we can describe as the terrible megalomania of the Democrats. Because we're going to be doing a segment today on the podcast about how the Democrats, whenever they lose a vote, whenever they fail to achieve something, the first reaction you get from them is, right, okay, well, we need to change the system. And I really hate this kind of mindset. It's like, okay, we have established what the American people should want, and if we can't get it, then the problem is the system, which is the checks and balances of government, rather than the destination we're trying to achieve. What do you think about that? Like, what do you think is driving this?
Um, It's interesting because there's a similar attitude in Australia with the left. They think that, if they lose an election or their preferred causes don't go through, then somehow it's everyone else's fault and something else is wrong and it's nothing to do with them. And
Same
I
with Labour
think,
here, incidentally. By the way, it's the same.
oh,
Like Jeremy Corbyn came out, even though he suffered a historic defeat in the election. He said he
oh
won
yes.
the argument. And it's like,
Oh my God. Like, and that's the thing. I reckon they are so, to put it crudely, up themselves. And they are so sure that they are on the right side of history and they have
mm,
moral superiority and their way is the right way. And if they're not getting voted in, well, it's just the little people don't understand them and it needs to be explained to them. And oh, we have to change something so we get in because we are the morally righteous ones and everything else is somehow wrong. And it always irritates me when they talk about democracy because they spent 4 years when Trump won saying democracy is broken,
yeah.
democracy is fragile. It's absolutely broken. Next minute, Biden wins, and it's suddenly, democracy is working again. It's one. And I'm like, no, it was working the first time. You just
Yeah.
didn't get the result you want. In any case, the US isn't actually a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. But we had the same thing here a couple of years ago when our Conservative Party, which is incidentally called the Liberal Party, unexpectedly won that election. The left just went mad and they were saying, oh my God, democracy is broken. It's like, no, democracy works. You just didn't get your preferred result. And I've realized the left, they talk a lot about democracy and protecting democracy. They don't actually care about democracy. And in fact, they don't like democracy because
Yeah.
democracy sometimes gives them results that they don't want. So it's a combination of ego, believing you're morally superior, and a real kind of megalomania that contributes to that attitude, I reckon.
I think you've really hit it on the head there. Their view of democracy is that we win every time, whereas my view of democracy is sometimes I don't win. And that's the point. It's about power sharing, isn't it? It's about accepting that the other side has a legitimate moral claim to a certain sort of sphere of influence in the society. And the Democrats have this completely totalitarian view. And just the left, I don't want to just say, it's just the Democrats. It's not just the Democrats. It's every single left-wing party has this completely totalitarian view of politics. And if the right wins anything, then the right has either cheated or democracy has failed. And I just can't get over it because, I don't even consider myself necessarily like a right winger, right? I consider myself a centrist, and I'm just watching the left battering the right continually, and the right barely being able to stand up for itself. And I'm like, okay, come on, guys, you need to hold up the side here because I don't really want these people having uncontested control of our civilizations. They seem to be quite radical, don't they?
They are very radical, and they have all these. They have these ideas that you just know lead to bad places. I mean, if we look at, the history of the 20th century, if that's told us anything, it's that socialism and really far left policies are bad and they never work and they've never worked anywhere that they've tried. And, there's, what's they saying? Like the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing again and again and again, expecting a different result. So they have this very sort of radical notion of things, but they disguise it by pretending, by calling themselves liberal in the case of America, and also constantly claiming the moral high ground, which tends to sort of dupe people who are well-meaning and maybe a little bit gullible, but it is a concern, and I totally agree with you on what you're saying about the right needing to kind of hold up the side, because it's just not happening, and it's partially to do with the fact that the left is so disproportionately represented in institutions like the media, like specifically the media. I mean, they're all like this.
It's very left wing,
and that just makes it difficult for conservatives. But it's also not in the nature for conservatives to actually be combative or radical or anything. That's it's not a reactionary ideology. And I think that is not serving the right well at all at this stage of the culture war.
Yeah, I've noticed that the Conservatives don't seem to be putting forth a positive worldview. And in the face of this kind of, I mean, like overzealous proselytizing from the left. It's insane how confident the left are in the righteousness of their own cause. And like you say, the disasters of the 20th century don't matter at all to the left. It's bizarre. I mean, if I had created something that had messed up on that scale, I would at least have some humility at that point, but they don't have any kind of self-reflection. I mean, what do you say to leftists when they just avoid the subject, when they say, well, but this time it'll work, but this time it'll work? Like, what do you say to that?
Well, it's very kind of it's very very hard to actually have the argument with them because I've noticed. Oh, by the way, sorry, pause for a second. If you can hear a noise in the background, there's a giant helicopter flying over the house
No, I can't hear a
right
thing.
now. Oh, that's good because the mics usually pick it up.
No, you sound great.
Oh, that's good. On that subject, yeah, it's really hard to actually have the argument with them because they will just interrupt you. And I have noticed this specifically with leftists. If it looks like they're losing a point, if you're trying to have any kind of discussion with them, it doesn't matter how polite you're being,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what facts you're putting forward or how open you are to it. They will up the level and they'll up the volume and they will start interrupting and then they'll start calling you names. I mean, I was actually in an Uber a few weeks ago on the way to the Sky News studio. And for some reason, I got chatting with the Uber driver. He's like, oh, where are you going? Oh, off to work. Oh, you're going to the newspaper building. Oh, yeah. Do you work for Sky News Australia? And I was like, oh, you're kidding. And he started harassing me because I worked for a specific news organization, of course, which is News Corp, and of course the left thinks, oh, it's the evil Rupert Murdoch. And I tried very calmly to sort of explain a few things to him, and I thought it was fine. But the minute I got sort of an edge on the argument, he'd just interject and interject and interject. And I thought, well, really, I shouldn't have engaged with him. But sometimes I just think, you know what, stuff you, I'm going to go for
Yeah,
you.
dude, I'm giving you 1 star. Sorry. Yeah.
Did I ever give him 1 star and a bad review? But it was a pattern just generally with leftists. They're not interested in having the argument because they are so sure that they are correct. So if you contradict them, well, you must be a horrible, scummy person. And it's a peculiar attitude.
So I mean, one of the things I've noticed actually, and it just occurred to me as you were talking, that we're actually having like an imaginary argument with the left when we talk about these things. When they say sort of, oh, this time it'll work. Well, what are they doing there? They're creating like a fantasy world where they're saying, oh, my perfect thing is going to turn out this way if you just let me do it. It's like, but I'm not arguing your fantasies. You know, I don't see why I have to engage, and I don't know why we do. But that was I don't want to go off on a tangent. So tell me about the way that Sky News Australia is received in Australia then, because I've got to be honest, I view Australia as kind of a left-wing place as well, even though it seems to be quite autocratic in some ways. The general media environment seems to be left-wing, just like it is over here. And so Sky News Australia look like they're being treated like pariahs. Is that an accurate impression, or am I just misreading it there?
There is a very kind of vocal group of people who are very against Sky News Australia, and they've been trying to attack Sky for years now. I mean, and it generally is sort of, you know, lobbed up on Twitter. You know, what they do is they go for the advertisers, so they're quite serious about it. You know, they'll try to hit Sky in the wallet, and sometimes it's worked, but Sky has got really used to that. Like, it's very used to fielding them off. But there is this very noisy group of people who treat Sky like they treat Fox News, and it's sort of interesting because Sky News in Australia, it's cable TV, so it's literally pay TV. It doesn't have as big of an audience as a lot of the free-to-air channels, like not by a long shot. But because Sky exists, the very nature of its existence is totally taboo to these sort of left-wing activists, because they don't want any dissent at all in the media. And this is what I have realized. I think if like a Labor government, a Labor Party was in power in Australia, they would be very keen for a totally state-controlled media. You know, that they do not believe in dissent or a difference of opinion. And yeah, Sky gets targeted a lot, but you know, their head honchos are very resilient, which is good, and they know how to handle it.
That's good, because, and I mean, we describe Sky News Australia as being right-wing, but I can't really think of any kind of ideologically right-wing position that Sky News Australia. I've watched a lot of clips on YouTube as well. I can't really think of any, like, you know, I don't hear them citing Milton Friedman or Mises or anything like this, because it's a news show. It's not, you know, a propaganda show or an education show. So it just strikes me that I could describe it as just a common sense station, if nothing else, you know, which is sorely lacking in the UK, frankly. But right, so where do you think this is all going? I mean, do you think the left is going to be successful ultimately? Because it looks to me like they're massively well funded, like compelled by their own consciences to activism, and seem to enjoy the victories of tearing down cultural achievements and cultural monuments. And so it looks to me that the war against the left is pretty daunting. It's an implacable foe. Do you think we can win?
Look, I find the whole concept genuinely terrifying. I find it very, very intimidating for all of the reasons that you have just mentioned, and because they are so prevalent within the cultural institutions. I mean, obviously the media, we've got academia as well. So you have so many young people who are so impressionable and so well-meaning with these massively Marxist professors, drilling critical race theory into them. It's a really difficult war to win, and particularly since, of course, that famous Time magazine article came out. I think it was on the 4th of February. They're all very deliberately and consciously in cahoots with each other. I mean, we heard about the well-funded cabal that got together to, fortify,
Yes.
not rig, the election. And I read that article and I thought, how do we compete with that? I mean, what do we do? But my feeling is that they will eventually trip over their own hubris, as these things tend to go. I mean, we saw
Yeah.
really with the Time article. That was risky, them just bragging about it. We saw cracks with AOC when she told a fabricated version of what terrible danger she was apparently in on the 6th.
I think we can just call it a massive whopper. That I would definitely have sent my children to their rooms over telling me a lie like that.
I know. It was a massive whopper. I mean, the timeline just did not fit. But also, I think their policies are horrible. I mean, all the orange man bad crowd that voted for Biden, and because they're thinking, oh wow, there'll be a lockdown and a mask man. It's like, hello, I'm in Australia. We've had lockdowns and mask mandates nationally. They suck.
Same here.
Going to hate them. So I think ultimately they might just annihilate themselves, and we'll just sort of plod along with a bucket and a mop and then clean up after them.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that there is something to clean up when it's over, because I mean this really has just shades of previous eras of cultural revolutions written all over it, and the problem that we have is that how I find it's really difficult to get left-wing activists to actually engage with the alternative. And this is why I think the Trump's impeachment trial was actually fantastic, because they're so not used to having someone present the counter-argument that like Callum was describing on the podcast yesterday, it's like they were expecting a show trial, being unaware that the Republicans would then present their case and point out that this is a lie, you've been calling for violence this whole time, or fight this, fight that. And so it's really interesting how they seem to be living in this kind of almost delusional world that is building up to something presumably quite terrible. But right, so what gives you hope for the horizon? Like what's on the horizon that you're optimistic about, if anything, dare I ask?
Look,
I'll take that pause as a bad sign.
Look, it's tricky sometimes to see through the darkness, because I think, oh my God, well, the Democrats are in power. That has a flow-on effect to Australia. I mean, people often ask me why I'm so interested in American politics. I'm like, you would not believe the effect American politics has on Australia. It is absolutely profound. But I remind myself that despite the well-funded cabal that was against Trump, despite all the spin, all the activism, all of that, 75 million people still voted for him. 75 million people managed to cut through the rubbish and place their votes for Trump. And when you consider the kinds of forces that were against him, I mean, there would be stuff going on behind the scenes that you and I cannot even fathom with the types of forces that were against him. And I mentioned Trump sort of because he's a symbol kind of the whole thing. I thought to myself, a lot of people can actually see through the rubbish. So if people can continue to remain awake like that, we may actually come through this all right.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point that I think is worth elaborating on, because we have exactly the same effect and phenomena in Britain, where what happens in America really has an effect over here culturally. The wokeness itself. Did you see Macron and the French government calling wokeness American ideology, and that this is a threat to French identity and therefore France?
Oh, I heard something about that, but I hadn't heard it in detail. But if
as a brief
insane.
overview, it was excoriating. They were just categorical. I mean, they sounded very much like myself when I'm talking about this. How this is a dangerous threat to the French identity, and it's come from America, and it must be resisted at all costs. And in fact, they claim that Le Pen was too weak on it, and things like this. And it's like, oh my goodness, okay. And so,
Whoa.
yeah, I mean, it's just talk at the moment, but I mean, that's quite strong, you know.
That's huge.
Yeah,
That's huge. And I wouldn't have expected that from Macron. And for him to say that Le
yeah.
Pen was too weak on it, that's a massive step in the right direction.
Yeah, he described it as Islamo-leftism. Because the point being open, the leftists essentially he's saying that they reduce our defenses to resist morally the advance of Islam, and I was like, wow, this is bloody strong rhetoric from Macron. Like you say, you don't expect it. But in Australia, do you have any kind of political will to push back in that, but perhaps not quite that extreme because they're the French, so of course they're going to be extreme about it. But is there any kind of political will pushing back against wokeness?
Yeah, there's a lot, which is really, really good. There are a lot of very noisy conservative politicians on the backbench who are relentlessly calling this stuff out and also calling out the COVID alarmism, etc. There's a really Australia. I mean, it gets sort of pegged as sort of a left-wing-ish country.
Yeah.
That's because we're a welfare state. So when you put us up against the USA, for instance, we look quite left-wing in the fact that we have universal health care, and we have a government-funded university loan system, which is very effective, and we also have really strict gun laws. So put up against the states, we look quite leftist and quite woke, but we're really not. Like your average Australian is pretty based and kind of skeptical and doesn't sort of like hysterics. You've got your sort of inner city latte sipping lefties, as we like to call them. There's that faction, but they are a noisy minority. They tend to vote for the Greens, and a lot of them tend to move more to the right anyway as they get older. So there is this very sensible undercurrent in Australia, as we saw with the last election win. So that gives me comfort. There is that anchor there, certainly.
Well, that's good. I mean, we're actually seeing, after years of this kind of political infection in the current discourse, we are finally seeing the Conservatives, even in this country, like, at least blinking in the face of it and going, okay, maybe this is actually bad, and maybe we shouldn't be encouraging this. So I suppose there's some good news from over here as well, by the way. What was I going to say? There was one last question I want to end on, and it's totally escaped me, and I'm very frustrated because I thought it was a very good one. That was what I was going to say. So it's a weird question for like someone to ask a conservative, but because of the way that the left has politicized certain segments of society, I think it might be informative if you could give us an overview of what like left-wing race politics looks like in Australia, because over in Britain and America, I think everyone can see a fairly good example of it. But I think that a lot of people won't know what it's like in Australia because they won't know what like Australia's, whether you've got many immigrants there, what the native Aboriginal conditions are, and things like this. So I was wondering if you just give me a brief overview for the use of the people watching.
It's really at the moment very focused around the Indigenous community. I mean, there was a while there it was all about Muslims. You know how the left kind of jumps from trend to trend. This is what I've realized. They're kind of bandwagoners. But right now it's very, very much geared towards the Indigenous community. There's a debate that happens every year over the date of Australia Day, which is, recognizing, I guess the colonization of Australia. It's sort of the first fleet kind of thing. And there's a big push to kind of change the date push because Indigenous, activists will say that, oh, it's racist and it symbolizes colonization and lots of people died and it was horrible. And it's like, yeah, okay, those things are true. The Indigenous people were not treated well at all by white settlers. But my argument and most people's argument is, well, I would like to think that as a nation, we can reconcile and move on, and Australia Day can be celebrated as something lovely for everyone. But there's this very hardcore contingent of critical race theorist activists who are very, very anti that. And with the Black Lives Matter protest last year in the US, that made a giant leap to Australia. And we had tens of thousands of people going out and marching in the context of Indigenous deaths in custody, for instance. So you can draw a reasonable parallel, but the thing about Indigenous deaths in custody is that I don't have the exact data, but the vast majority of Indigenous people who've died in custody since like the 90s died of natural causes or of self-harm. It's not a case of police brutality. In any sort of sense of the word, but they're really, really noisy about it. It's very, very in vogue at the moment. And what infuriates me though about it, like it makes me so mad, is that all this sort of semantic talk about changing the date of Australia Day and all this symbolic stuff, it doesn't do anything to address the real problems in a lot of Indigenous communities. I mean, it's heartbreaking. There's dreadful problems with alcoholism and drug addiction, domestic violence, child neglect, and just isolation. There's these very remote rural communities. There's no access to jobs. There's no access to education. Nothing like that. It makes me quite emotional. But if you mention that in public or on the television, as I have, you will get called like the worst kind of racist for even daring to mention that could be any other problem there that is self-perpetuating. And there have been so many billions of tax dollars poured into the Indigenous community, but there's no improvement, and it's sort of getting worse. So I get so mad at those critical race theorist activists, because I think all you're doing is standing on the street and yelling about a date. Do something. So that's where the debate centers in Australia.
Right, that's fantastic. Daisy, thank you so much for joining us. I take it that people can just find you by just searching Daisy Cousens on YouTube. So that
Indeed, yep. Just type in my name, Cousens with an E, E-N-S, and you will find me.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.